Hi, this is John, and today we're going to go through part 2 of my tutorial series on creating an installer for your Unreal project. So, just as a brief review of what we looked at in the last tutorial, um, the workflow for working with the Nullsoft Scriptable Install System is something like this. We're creating a script file, and that script file has any number of references to other files and different things, and that then gets compiled into an installer that we can send out to people and they can install on their system. So before we actually look at the various parts of the code that we're going to write, let's go ahead and define a couple things right here up front. So this is a lot of words, but let me quickly go through each of these and tell you what these things mean, because you're going to see examples of these in a moment. So in the Nullsoft Scriptable Install System, you have what are known as installer attributes. These installer attributes are just specific words that are understood by the compiler to mean something. So let me give you an example of what one of those might be. So here in this file, let's go back to our example 1 that we looked at in the first tutorial. So here in the example 1, you'll see on this line 11 we have name, and then we have example 1 here in quotes. So this word name is understood by the system. Basically, we're telling the system, okay, the name of our installer is going to be this. So this is a keyword that is already understood by the installer. Another one would be outfile, for example. So that's what we mean by installer attributes. The next thing that we're going to look at are instructions. So the Nullsoft Scriptable Install System uses different commands to do things. So an example of a command or an instruction might be something like file, for example. So in this case, file is a command that the system understands, and it understands that this command is basically saying, okay, here's the file that I want to use. Okay? Or set output path, for example, would be another one of these instructions. So these are commands that the system uses to do things. The next concept you're going to want to be familiar with is includes. So an include in a script file is just a reference to another file that exists on your hard drive that has more code in it that you want to access and use in your script. So if we look at our example here, this simple example does not have any includes because it's very simple. Let's see if one of these others has an include here. Okay, so here this basic.nsi, the basic installer for the modern UI example that comes with the installed system. And so you can see here on line 8 we have this word include, and we have this file here in quotes. And one thing that may seem a little bit weird is we're not specifying a full path here to this file, this .nsh file. So includes that exist within a certain file structure within the system are understood. So in this case, this modern UI example, so here I am in program files, and here in the examples directory in modern UI, here's the basic script file that I'm looking at. Because this is within our NSIS folder, it's understood where this include file is coming from. So actually, if we go and we look for it, we come back up here and we see a folder called include. And if we go into this include folder, we can see here's the name of that file, MUI, Modern User Interface. Oh, except this is using MUI 2. So here it is, Modern User Interface 2, in our include directory. And if we actually open that and look at it, we'll see that it actually just creates a reference. It's just including inside of it a reference to this other file, which is the actual header file that's doing all the work. And it's putting that in contrib modern UI 2. So if we go up here, here's that folder, modern UI 2, and then modern UI 2 .nsih or nsh, sorry, which is a header file for the Nullsoft Scriptable Install System. So if I open this, you can see here, oops, this is the file that actually contains all of the things that we are using inside of that basic script. So there's macros in here, there's all sorts of things defined. So when we use an include, we're basically saying, hey, compiler, go grab this other header file that lives here and let me use some of the stuff in it. Okay, so that's what that is doing. And then we can go ahead and we can grab macros like these down here, and we can use those inside of our script when they're defined over here in this other script. Okay, so that's the idea with an include. The next concept we're going to need to be familiar with are pages. So when you're creating an installer, at least an interactive installer that a user is going to interact with, you're going to want a set of pages where they're going to go ahead and they're going to click through your installer, accepting license agreements, deciding on what they want to install as far as the components, etc. And we can define those in this system with various macros, or you can also use this page instruction here. So you can see here we use the word page and we're going to create a directory page. Okay, so there are various ways that a page can be defined. In here in this basic modern UI script, we're using macros that are defined in the header file to actually create our pages. In this very simple example 1, we're just using the page instruction to create those pages. So the next concept that we want to look at are sections. And the best way to think of a section is it's just a chunk of code that may or may not run depending on what the user selects in your installer. So to explain that, let me actually just run an installer here. So I have the basic installer loaded up here. Let me recompile it and we'll run the installer here so you can see I have my license agreement. So this right here, this components page, is basically the sections that you are creating. So if I had an installer that was installing a lot of things potentially, I might have various sections in here. Like I might have one that's going to install the main program. I'll have another section that's going to install documentation. I'll have another section that's going to install optional content. And the user can come in here and they can select or deselect what components they want to install. And so sections are what are defining what shows up in this list. So you can see an example of a section here in this example 1. And we have section starts with the word section and it ends with the word section end. And so everything defined in here is the section that we are putting inside of our install. So basically right here our section, actually this is not the example, we're looking at the basic. So this is the section that we're looking at here called dummy section. You can see that right there. And see dummy section right here. So if we had multiple sections, we could put all of those different sections in our components list. You'll also notice that there is a section for the uninstall. So in these very simple scripts, we just have one section that's for what we're going to install, another section for what we're going to uninstall. Okay, so that's the concept of sections. The next important thing to know about our functions, and for this tutorial, let's just look at functions as a way to execute a little chunk of code with some instructions that we might want to use. That's basically what a function is. Okay, we'll look at a small example of functions in a little bit. Macros are very similar to functions, except a macro is generally defined in a different file. It's generally something that would come included in an include. And a macro basically inserts code into your script at compile time. And it inserts it as is. So it's almost like copying and pasting that chunk of code into your script. And you might say, well, what's the difference between functions and macros? Um, Without getting into too much detail, the real difference in this system are how they are called. Let's just leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. If you want more detail on what functions and macros do and how they differ, there's a lot of information in the documentation. So next let's look at variables. For those that are unfamiliar with coding or scripting, a variable is basically just a word that is a reference to store a value. So one important thing to note is that variables inside this system are global. So what that means is that once you define a variable, you can use it wherever within your script. Um, don't worry about that if you don't know what that means. Um, just know that for the Nullsoft Scriptable Install System, when you declare a variable, you can use it anywhere. So here's an example of a variable. For example, we're using this define statement here to actually create this variable called app name. And this app name variable is given a value. And here's the value of that variable, which is a string, which is basically just words. It's text. We put it inside those quotes. And so now this word app name references this value of this string. So wherever we put app name, you can see we put it here, we put it here, here. Wherever we put that, it's going to insert these words inside of there. Okay, so when we declare the name of our application, we're just using the variable app name. And you can see that references this up here. Okay, so that's how a variable is working. Notice also the syntax we're using for the variable. So when we define it up here, we've defined it in all caps, but when we're calling it, we use a $sign and curly brackets, okay, to actually call our variable, to use our variable, okay? So that's important. So the last thing to look at are constants, and constants are variables that are consistent in what they define. So what I mean by that are these are variables that are already set up for you by the system that reference something very specific. So an example would be something like, let's find an example in these. Okay, here's an example right here in this basic script. So this right here is a variable, $sign local app data. So this variable is known by the system to mean the local app data location on your Windows machine. Okay, all right, here's another one. So SM programs is another one to be familiar with. This is start menu programs. So this actually is referencing the start menu programs directory on your system. Here's another variable that's a constant, desktop. So the desktop constant refers to your Windows desktop. There are a lot of different constant variables, and you can actually find these if you bring up your Nullsoft Scriptable Install System menu here, and you go ahead and click on the User's Manual. It brings up this manual, and you'll find in here all sorts of information, really great information. Here's information about constants. So here are examples of those constant variables. Program files, you've got common files, desktop, you've got all of these different variables that the system already knows about and you can just use to get to various places. So those are very useful constants. Okay, so those are the basic concepts that I wanted to go over before actually diving into the code. But let's go ahead and let's dive into the code now, and let's look at some of these examples and pick them apart. So let's start with our example 1 that we had already looked at before. Actually, I take that back. Let's go to our basic example. It's a little more complex, but I think it's more fleshed out, it's more usable, and it has all of the components that we just talked about. So this basic example you can find here in your program files. If you go into the NSIS directory in examples, modern UI, basic, that is what we are looking at right there. So you can edit that, and here it is. Okay. So once again, the green text is all comments. These are things that are not being actually used by the machine. They are just here for our benefit. And we start a comment with a semicolon. So if I go ahead and I put that down, I can write anything in here. And it's not going to be used by the machine. It's only there for my information. Okay? So once again, you should comment when you're writing your scripts. It helps other people. And it helps you when you forget what you've done. So the first actual usable line of code that will be read by our computer is this include. Okay, and I already talked about what this include is doing. It's bringing in this other file, which is this mui2.nsh, which is a header file that's already been written for us, and I showed you where that exists. So it points to this file, which points to another file, and in that file we've got a whole bunch of stuff, okay, that we're going to use. So the next section, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start setting some attributes of our installer. So we set the name of our installer, in this case modern UI test. Then we set the out file. This is the file that's actually going to be written when our installer is finished. It's going to be called basic.exe, and here it is actually on my desktop. I've got basic.exe, and this is what we will actually click to run our installer. Okay, so that is the out file. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set the installation directory. Where do we want to put the stuff that we are installing on the user's system? So in this case, we're using this variable local app data to specify the local application data location on our system. So generally, you would want this to be something like program files. So, for example, over here, in this script, which is a little bit more advanced, we are using this particular variable, which is program files. Let's go back to basic here, and I'll paste it in. So you might want that to be program files, and then name here a folder where you're going to put your stuff. Okay, and it will automatically create that folder for you, which is very nice. You don't have to do any of that work. Just put the name in here and it will be created for you. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we are going to set up the registry keys. So this is important on your Windows system to be able to keep track of your program that you've installed and to be able to uninstall it later. And honestly, I don't pretend to be an expert on registry keys and how to work with the registry. I've just been following the examples that are here in the example scripts. But basically, just go ahead and in here, go ahead and put in the name of your folder of your installer. Okay, so if you go ahead and just follow the syntax that's already here and you put in your own thing, it'll do the right thing for you. Okay, And if you want to read more up on registry keys, you can read that in the manual as well. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to request the execution level privileges for our installer. So sometimes you might need your installer to install in program files, for example. And program files is a directory that requires administrator privileges to install into. So if you are going to install into program files, you will probably need to request administrator privileges. So that's why when this was app data before, we can just use the user privilege. We don't need this to be admin. Okay, if this was admin, we could then go ahead and we could install this in program files. And what this will do is when the user runs your installer, a little pop-up will come up that says, hey, if you're the administrator on your machine or you have administrator privileges, it will pop up this little box that says, do you want to make this change? And this is Windows' way of being secure in what gets installed on your system. So making sure that you don't go install stuff that you don't want installed, or that someone that's not an administrator can install things that will ruin the system. Okay, so that's what that is doing right there. So let's go ahead and go on to the next section. So we're going to set up some of our interface settings here. And this little line right here, this define MUI abort warning, is actually really important. So what this little line is doing in our code is this line is setting up a warning if we try and close the installer partway through. Okay, so if I run my installer and I'm going through it and halfway through my user decides they don't want to continue, if they hit the X or if they hit the cancel, what this will do is it will bring up a little pop-up and it will say, do you really want to quit this? And they can say no, they can say yes. Okay. If I don't have this, so let's actually comment it out. Put a semicolon in front and you notice it turns green. And if I save this and I bring up my compiler and I recompile it, and then I run the test installer, what happens now if they hit cancel is it just cancels. Okay, so there's no warning. So it's a good idea to have this in here. Okay, so that's what that's doing. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to set up the pages for our installer. And in this basic example here, this is using the modern UI examples. We are actually bringing those pages in via macros. Okay, so you notice this syntax we're using. We say insert macro, and then we put in the name of that macro. Okay, so if you want to know where you can find the names of these different pages, if you look in your documentation here and look in the modern UI 2 documentation here, you will find all the different pages listed here. So here they are, all the different installer pages that we could use and uninstaller pages, and then all the settings for all of those pages. So there's lots of documentation in here that can help you. So that is where you will find these guys. So by using these insert macro commands here, we can bring in each particular page that we want as part of our installer. So in this basic example, the first one we have is a license page, MUI page license. Okay, and here's our license page with the license on it. And then we can go to the next page. The next page is a components page. Here is the components page. Okay. The next page after that is the directory page, and here's that. And then we actually install the files, okay, which is what just happened there. Okay. So those are the various pages, and then we can close this, that we've set up for our installation. And then you'll notice we have uninstall pages as well. Okay, so that's what these are. UN page is an uninstall page. Okay, so we've set up all of our pages here. You'll notice with this license page, we're actually passing something in. Okay, we have a string here, and this string actually points to the location of our license text file. Okay, we'll look at that a little bit later. So we set up our pages. The next thing we do is we set what languages do we want to be able to use this installer with. This particular one is using English. Okay, and so we are using a macro to set that up here as well. The next thing we do is we set up our installer sections. And this installer is a basic installer. It's very simple. It only has one installer section, which we set up right here. And we give that a name. And then we go ahead and we run a couple of commands in here. The first one is we set our out path. Okay, so this is where we're going to put the files that we're copying onto the user system. And then we would put all of our files in here. Okay, this is where we would put a bunch of files. We would put all these in here, and these are what are going to get copied to the user system. We then write a registry key, and we create an uninstaller, okay, which we can do with this command right here, write uninstaller, and then the section ends. Okay, it's that simple. This next thing, we're setting up descriptions. Okay, so when we run our installer, and we're here in our components page, if I hover over the component, you'll notice a little description appears over here on the right. Okay, a test section. That is what we are setting up right here in this descriptions. Okay, so we set up this language string and we give it this name, and we're doing it in English, and then we write our text, which is the description, and then we assign that string to the various section. Okay, which in this case this is very simple because we only have one section. So we begin that description, we actually set the text for it, and you'll notice here that we are referencing the name of our section. Okay, right here, this section dummy variable right here. Okay, that's where we're referencing it, and so we're putting this text into this section. Okay, we're associating them, and then we go ahead and end that. Okay, so there's where we've set up our description. And last but not least, we have an uninstaller section. Okay, so we've called that uninstall. This is where we would put the files that we're going to uninstall, and then we delete our uninstaller file that we've created, and we remove the directory that we initially installed, and we delete the registry key. Okay, so that is the basic run through of this basic file for the modern user interface example. Okay, it's got all the basic components in it, and when you run that installer, you get something that looks just like this, and you can run through it, and it will complete the install, and you can close it, and you've installed, in this case, nothing on your system because we haven't put anything in here. Okay, so that is a look at the basic installer. I think this tutorial's gone on long enough. Hopefully we've covered some good terms and things. In the next tutorial, we will go ahead and we'll look at a more detailed example. We'll look at an actual installer that we've created for Volusion Studios to package up a demo that we have distributed. So we'll go ahead and look at that in the next demo. I hope this has been helpful, and we will see you next time.